On February 2nd, 2009, on Albuquerque's west side, a woman named Christine Ross set out for a routine walk with her canine companion, Ruka. As they trucked along a barren mesa near a new housing development, Ruka sniffed out something unusual, a large bone protruding from the sandy soil. Ross paused. The bone didn't look like it belonged to any animal native to the New Mexico desert. Unsure, she snapped a photo and texted it to her sister, a nurse, who soon confirmed Christine's suspicion. It was a human bone. That unsettling discovery would unearth one of the largest and most horrifying crime scenes in Albuquerque's history. And today, we are going to unpack all of it. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cult, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. So if you're into this sort of thing, please consider subscribing. I would absolutely love to have you here. We're going to take kind of a hard left from the psychological aspect of cults and focus on an unsolved mass murder case today. It could be a serial killer. I doubt these are 11 isolated events. There are tons of theories swirling, and it has been unsolved for almost 20 years, which is just utterly, utterly heartbreaking. And there are some trigger warnings. There is a lot. I mean, it's all of the victims are women and even an unborn child. So if that's something you're sensitive to hearing some details about, please use caution watching this video. And it's not I don't go into any, like, gruesome details because we don't really know all of those details, but this case is a really good example of how certain marginalized people or people who are part of certain communities, they aren't taken seriously when they go missing, and it's a really good example of not just pointing out that that needs to change, but that it is changing. So today we're going to focus a little bit more on the victims and who they were, and then towards the end, go through the forensic evidence, the investigation, and the theories that have swirled for years. I know it's a little bit different than the format that I normally have in my videos, but it is kind of a sensational story, and although I think it's good sometimes to tap into the sensationalism to bring awareness, for this case, I really just want to highlight that sex workers are people too, and you just don't know why someone is falling into that lifestyle. They might love it, or it might be a means to an end for them, or it might be something they're forced into, and all of those theories are being circulated here as to why these women were targeted. So, with all of that being said, sit back, try to relax. You might not be able to relax with content like this. But with all of that being said, let's jump right in. So, that discovery of what turned out to be a human femur on Albuquerque's West Mesa set in motion an investigation unlike anything the city had ever seen. That area, a wind-swept plateau overlooking the Rio Grande Valley, had been partially graded for a housing development that stalled after a housing crash. Years prior, developers had started setting up streets and even built a retaining wall and a stormwater pond to try to address flooding issues, and they inadvertently disturbed what laid beneath. So, in fact, it was this construction of a retention pond that was meant to alleviate neighborhood flooding is what likely exposed the first bones to the surface. So that Monday in early February, Ross's simple walk led to a ghastly find. She immediately notified Albuquerque's police, and officers quickly confirmed the bone was human. And I grew up in the West, and I remember kind of going on these like little desert hikes and seeing so many different animal bones. And I'm honestly kind of impressed that this woman was like, This does not look like an animal bone. I don't know if everyone would have that recognition. I certainly wouldn't, but again, I was a kid at the time, but it's so I can't even imagine coming across a human bone on my daily dog walk. Now, the next day, the desolate lot just off of 118th Street Southwest had transformed into an active crime scene with investigators, forensic teams, and heavy equipment on site, bracing themselves for what they might uncover. And over the ensuing weeks, detectives and FBI forensic archaeologists painstakingly evacuated the site from sun up to sundown. They sectioned off the sandy terrain and began unearthing one skeleton after the other. By mid February 2009, the remains of 11 individuals had been found buried in clandestine graves across a 92-acre area of the West Mesa. Among them were even the bones of an unborn child, later determined to have been the 4-month-old fetus of one of the victims. Albuquerque Police Chief Ray Schultz somberly announced that a serial killer was likely responsible for what was quickly deemed the city's largest crime scene ever. The media dubbed the unknown perpetrator the West Mesa Bone Collector, as investigators brought in anthropologists and heavy machinery to sift through dirt for any remaining evidence. The excavation itself was a massive undertaking. Around the clock digging continued for nearly a month. With each new set of skeletal remains, detectives logged the location with GPS and scored for any artifacts, bits of clothing, jewelry, IDs, anything that might help them identify the victims or yield at least some clue. But the killer had left virtually nothing behind with the bodies. Quote, "We believe the burying of the women's bodies is key," unquote, said APD cold case investigator Liz Thompson years later, noting that the perpetrator had the means and the know-how to methodically dig graves and dispose of victims without leaving obvious clues like clothing, personal items, shell casings, or visible trauma. And indeed, as the dig progressed, police noted an eerie absence of belongings. The victims had been found nude or wrapped in plastic trash bags with no purses, no cell phones, not even shoes remaining. This suggested the killer had gone to lengths to remove anything that could identify the women or trace back to him. And as winter turned to spring, the focus shifted from recovering remains to trying to identify them. The Office of the Medical Investigator carefully examined each skeleton. There were no obvious bullet holes or knife marks on the bones. The cause of death for all 11 women was officially listed as homicidal violence of undetermined type. The medical examiner noted that certain methods like strangulation or suffocation might not leave any skeletal injuries, meaning those causes could not be ruled out. In other words, the killer may have subdued and killed the victims in ways that left little forensic trace. A chilling prospect that made the murders even harder to solve. Meanwhile, forensic experts began the arduous task of putting names to the bones. They turned to DNA and dental records, comparing profiles against missing persons databases. Families who had reported missing daughters years earlier waited anxiously for news. And can you imagine missing someone and agonizing for years over where they are? And it must be such a twisted mental feeling to have, because a gravesite should never give one hope, right? But if someone's been missing for years, you just want to know what's happening to them. I can't imagine the families of the victims in this and how painful of a situation this must have been. In November 2009, nearly 9 months after the discovery, police announced they had identified several of the West Mesa victims. 15-year-old runaway Salania Edwards was the lone out-of-state victim, identified via dental records. 24-year-old Virginia Cloven and 27-year-old Evelyn Salazar were confirmed through DNA. Then, in January 2010, the last victim was named, 15-year-old Jamie Barella, Evelyn Salazar's cousin, who had vanished with her in 2004. It took nearly a year to identify all of the victims. And this just shows you the toll of time on the remains and the painstaking work that was required. Now, behind dry forensic reports and the sensationalism of the moniker of there being a bone collector in real life, there were 11 very real women and an unborn baby. These were daughters, mothers, aunts, nieces, friends. All but one of the victims had been living on the margins, struggling with either drug addiction or working in the sex trade, but often both. And this tragically might have made their disappearances less urgently noticed by authorities at the time. I mean, I think we all know that for some reason, if you have a certain job or a certain identifiable quality, it seems like certain law enforcement don't take your disappearance as seriously. It is absolutely a travesty. I'm actually working on the Gilgo murders, and I've like done a lot of watching deep dives and a lot of watching different docuseries, and I know a lot of people have talked about it, so let me know if you would be interested in that case. I would love to cover it here. Sometimes I will watch a documentary and I'll be like, I want to cover this case, I want to cover this case, but then I'll see like every single other true crime creator covering it and I'm like, I shouldn't even bother. But let me know if it's something that you're interested in. But now back to this case, because there was only young Jamie Barella at 15 who was the youngest victim, and she was the only one who had no known involvement with drugs or sex work. Yet each woman still had people who loved and missed her, despite what she did for work or what was causing her to have an addiction. As APD detective Ida Lopez, the missing persons investigator who had long been tracking Albuquerque's disappearing women, put it, these women were loved. Each one has a unique story, and their families want answers. So today we are going to profile each of these victims in order of their disappearance and presumed killing in an effort to remember their lives beyond those labels. Monica Diana Candelaria was 22, and she was the first of the West Mesa victims to go missing. She was last seen in May 2003, and she grew up in Albuquerque's South Valley. According to friends, Monica had a warm smile and a gentle heart. But in her late teens, she fell in with kind of a rough crowd and developed a drug habit. By 2003, she had occasional run ins with the law and was rumored to be involved in sex work to try to support her addiction. And in fact, Monica's name did surface years before the bodies were even found. One rumor reported to police was that Monica had been killed and buried out on the mesa, but with no evidence, the tip went unconfirmed. Unconfirmed. You didn't just decide to go check out the mesa, which has, I mean, it became a gravesite because no one was checking on the tips? Like, why? I mean, it was true. Had you gone to see if she had been buried there, maybe nobody else would have been buried there. Maybe this killer would have, I mean, potentially paused. Or stopped, been a little too afraid to get caught. I don't know. Additionally, Monica's remains were among the first uncovered in 2009, and this provided some closure to her family at last. Official records indicate that she was likely killed sometime between 2003 and 2005, and then just buried and dumped at that 118th Street site. For Monica's loved ones, the discovery ended years of not knowing, but it did open up new wounds of learning what horrors she had faced. Today, there's a plaque at the Memorial Park on the West Mesa that bears Monica's name, ensuring that she is not forgotten among the others. Secondly, we have Victoria or Vicky Chavez. She was 26 and she disappeared in June 2003. Another 2003 date. I mean, this person was just like on a spree. Victoria was a vivacious mother of two who was known for her outgoing, fun-loving personality. She enjoyed hiking and camping, her mother, Mary, later reminisced, marveling at how her adventurous daughter's life had met such a tragic end. Like several of the victims, Victoria had struggled with substance abuse. After a difficult divorce, she drifted into Albuquerque's notorious war zone, which is a neighborhood that was considered to be a high crime area along Central Avenue. And her family admits that yes, she was a prostitute. But still, they never stopped worrying about her. When Victoria stopped calling home in the summer of 2003, her family decided to report her missing. Mary Gutierrez spent the next 6 years fearing the worst. And that fear was confirmed when Victoria's remains were identified among the West Mesa victims. At a memorial service, Mary clutched a photo of her daughter and asked through tears, how could one person or anyone do this to 11 girls? And that is a question that still lingers over the city. Our third victim is Salania Mimi Edwards. She was just 15 years old. And she was also the only victim who wasn't from New Mexico. She was a teenage runaway from Lawton, Oklahoma, and she had a really difficult early life. By 2003, she'd run away from state custody and drifted across state lines. In May 2004, Salania was seen in the company of prostitutes on East Colfax Avenue in Aurora, Colorado, hundreds of miles from home. She was only 15, but reportedly using nicknames like Chocolate or Mimi while living on the streets. Albuquerque detectives believe Salania made her way down to New Mexico somehow, where she met the same fate as the others. She was classified as an endangered runaway in Oklahoma, but local authorities had no idea she'd end up the victim of a serial killer all the way in Albuquerque. Salania's remains were identified in November 2009 via a forensic sketch and dental records, finally linking her unsolved missing persons case to the West Mesa crime scene. She was the only African American victim, and the fact that she had no local ties initially stumped investigators. Her identification was a breakthrough that showed that the killer's reach extended beyond Albuquerque's local sex trade. Salania's short life ended tragically on the Mesa, far from anyone she knew. And today she is remembered as a troubled girl who, despite her hardships, did have people who cared about her and desperately wished for her safe return. Now we have Dorene Marquez, 24 years old. Dorene was a devoted mother of two young children who, by accounts from all family, fell upon hard times in her early 20s after her longtime boyfriend and father to her kids ended up going to prison. She was once a pretty and popular student at Albuquerque High School, but then she spiraled into drug addiction and depression when her home life collapsed. She began hanging around the motels and party houses near Central Avenue and might have turned to sex work to try to feed her habit, but also her family. She also went missing in 2003, and for years, her mother and sisters searched for her in drug dens and even hired a private investigator, all to no avail. When Dorene's remains were finally found on the West Mesa in 2009, her family felt both devastation but a cruel sense of relief. In a tribute, Dorene's daughter, Destiny, described her mom in loving terms. Quote, I believe she was an amazing woman. I always wanted long, gorgeous hair like hers, she wrote, recalling childhood memories. Dorene's family have been vocal in calling for justice and reminding the world that despite her struggles, Dorene was more than a statistic. She was a beloved mother, a daughter, and a sister. Photographs show a smiling young woman with dark flowing hair, a stark contrast to the anonymous way she was discarded in the desert. And her memory now lives on not just through her children, but in advocacy. Her relatives often attend the West Mesa memorial events, holding her photo high so no one forgets her name. Veronica Romero, who was only 28, was known for being smart, funny, and tough. Veronica was streetwise and well known among Albuquerque's nighttime street scene. She was last seen around Valentine's Day in 2004. A male friend named Dean later recounted that he had given Veronica a ride home one night and dropped her off on the street. He saw her get into a truck and then never saw her again. And it was this ominous last sighting, Veronica climbing into a stranger's car, which is probably a scenario that played out with many of the victims that was so disturbing when you heard his story. Veronica struggled with cocaine addiction and had multiple prostitution arrests, but she was also a protective aunt and friend. Other women on the streets remembered how Veronica would watch out for them. When her remains turned up in the mass grave, those who knew her were heartbroken. Investigators surmise that Veronica likely was one of the later victims buried, possibly in as early as 2004. She left behind her young son, and today a cross bearing her name stands at the memorial site, and her family contributes to the reward fund in hopes that someone will speak up about the truck she entered that fateful night. Now, we're starting to see a theme here with who was targeted. All of these women were young. All of these women had some type of addiction and might have been impressionable and maybe feeling a lack of hope. Because now we have Jamie, who is just a high school sophomore, and she was the youngest of the local victims, and notably, the only one with no history of prostitution or drugs. In late March 2004, Jamie went to a family barbecue with her 27-year-old cousin, Evelyn Salazar, and the two were inseparable that day. After the gathering, they told relatives they were heading to a nearby park, Wilson Park, in southeast Albuquerque, and that they would be back later. But they never returned. Initially, Jamie was considered a runaway, but her mother, Lorraine Bear, insisted Jamie wouldn't just vanish willingly. When the West Mesa remains were found 5 years later, Jamie's family feared the worst. And indeed, Jamie's skeleton was the last to be identified in January 2010, confirming that the teen had been among the West Mesa serial killer's victims. This finding deeply shook investigators who had compiled a list of missing women but hadn't expected to find a 15-year-old schoolgirl among them. Jamie had dreams of becoming a veterinarian one day, loved by her teachers for her kind heart, and her mother speaks of her as an innocent who was caught in a predator's web, possibly simply because she was in the wrong place with the wrong cousin, possibly her older cousin, at the wrong time. Jamie's presence among the victims is a poignant reminder that the killer's brutality spared no one, not even a literal child. Now, let's talk about her cousin, Evelyn Salazar, who was almost twice her age at 27 years old. Evelyn wasn't just Jamie's cousin, but she was her guardian that day in 2004 and would share the same fate. Evelyn was a mother leaving behind two young children when she disappeared. She'd grown up in Albuquerque's Atrisco neighborhood and, according to her family, had a very warm, caring nature. But Evelyn also struggled financially and had started using drugs. And I think that it feels sometimes from the outside that this is like counterintuitive. Oh, you're struggling with finances. Why are you spending money on drugs? They're not really serving you. But the stress, like financial stress, is unlike any other type of stress. I've been there before, and like you just want to crawl into a hole. You just want to totally like be a hermit. And there's a lot of shame associated with it. I can't even imagine having a kid and being stressed out financially. And I feel like a lot of times to cope with the stress and the shame and all of those feelings, people start using drugs. And if they're engaging in sex work, they might need the drugs to either stay up or to just cope with what they're doing if it's something they don't actually want to be doing. And yes, by 2004, she occasionally engaged in sex work. On April 3rd, 2004, Evelyn took Jamie with her as she planned to meet some people at the park near San Mateo and Gibson Southeast. It's totally unclear who they met or what transpired, only that neither woman was ever seen again. Evelyn's remains were among the first identified in late 2009 through DNA. The confirmation that both cousins died together was absolutely devastating for their family. It was a double tragedy. But it does make you think that this perpetrator was likely somebody who was seeking out sex workers. Now, Virginia Cloven was 24 and was last seen in April 2004. She'd been reported missing by her family, who knew of her struggles with drugs and occasional sex work, but never imagined she would end up a murder victim. She had a tattoo of the name Ivy on her arm and was known to frequent the same high-risk circuit as several other victims. I mean, this is someone who had to have rolled in the local crowds, which is just mortifying. And in fact, many of the West Mesa women knew each other from the streets. Virginia was actually friends with Julie Nieto and Michelle Valdez, and all three had at times stayed in the same area of East Central. Police believe Virginia was killed in 2004 or 2005 and buried by the same unknown assailant. Her father, unaware of her fate for years, said quietly after her identification, "At least now we know." Now, her friend Julie Nieto was also 24 and vanished in the late summer of 2004 and was a mother to a little boy and deeply loved by her family. She graduated from Highland High School in Albuquerque, but after losing a close friend to violence and a developing meth habit, Julie started to slide into a perilous lifestyle. Her mother, Eleanor Griego, tried desperately to pull Julie back, even checking her into rehab at one point. But unfortunately, Julie returned to the streets. The last time Eleanor saw her daughter was in August of 2004. Julie said she was going out and promised to be back. But when she didn't return, the family reported her missing. For 5 agonizing years, Eleanor held out hope. In 2009, that hope turned into heartbreak when Julie's remains were found on the mesa. Eleanor recalls the bittersweet relief of the moment. The day they told me they found her, it was like a relief. I don't have to be waiting no more, she said. In Julie's memory, her mother has become an advocate, participating in documentaries and police outreach. Julie's young son grew up with only faint memories of his mother. He was raised by family, knowing that his mother's death was part of something larger that he barely can even comprehend. Julie's bright face, as seen in photos, kind of makes it seem like there's no way this girl could have had any real troubles. And her family's pursuit of justice, from attending city council meetings to emailing detectives anytime they hear a rumor, ensure that Julie's name continues to be front and center in the fight to solve this case. And now we have Cinnamon Elks, who was the oldest of the victims at 32. She was well known to both law enforcement and the community of sex workers in Albuquerque. She'd been arrested at least 19 times for prostitution and related offenses. At 32, Cinnamon had spent over a decade in that life, and some reports suggest that she had once testified as a witness in another murder case of a sex worker. Could it all be connected? But she did disappear in August of 2004, and many who knew her suspected foul play immediately. It wasn't like Candy, as some called her, to simply leave without word. Cinnamon had a quick wit and earned a reputation for looking out for younger women on the street. She'd warn them about bad dates or dangerous men. One of those younger friends later told police that Cinnamon had mentioned being scared of a particular client shortly before she vanished. But unfortunately, that detail only surfaced after her remains were found. Police confirmed Cinnamon was likely killed in 2004 and buried not far from the others. Her remains were among those recovered early in the excavation, identified through forensic analysis soon after. And Cinnamon had a daughter who was just a toddler when she went missing. Family members later told media that they wished Cinnamon could have escaped the streets and gotten clean for her child's sake. She had a big heart, but the streets got a hold of her, one relative said at a memorial vigil. I understand that it's really hard for family members to grapple with that, but to me that feels a little, I don't want to say her family's victim shaming her because I know they're saying it out of concern, but I think when anyone kind of says like, well, why didn't they just get off the streets? Why were they still in this situation? If you don't, and I don't know, so if you do know, enlighten us all in the comments, but we just don't really know what the dynamic is like for someone that gets involved with sex work. Some women can be totally independent. Some women have someone that is setting up these dates for them and they have to answer to them. Some people are just very, very, for lack of a better word, desperate, and we don't know their situation. And so it's very important to always be compassionate because at the end of the day, these are human beings who are struggling with something. And I think we've all had those moments that we don't want anyone to see or judge. So let's it just breaks my heart when people judge them. And today, luckily, Cinnamon Elks' story is often cited by advocates pushing Albuquerque authorities to take reports of missing sex workers more seriously. Had Cinnamon's disappearance been given more weight in 2004, some argue that the pattern of missing women might have been noticed sooner. I mean, this was all happening within a year's span at this point. In death, Cinnamon stands as a symbol of both the vulnerability of women on the margins and the urgent need for society to protect them. Michelle Valdez was 22, and her case carries an especially poignant weight because she was 4 months pregnant when she was killed. The skeletal remains of her unborn daughter were found nestled with hers. This was considered to be the 12th life lost in this tragedy. Michelle had been missing since September 2004. Her father, Dan Valdez, reported her missing that fall, telling police that although Michelle had struggled with a heroin addiction, she always kept in touch with him and her stepmother. When the news came in 2009, Dan helped confirm Michelle's identity by providing her medical records. She'd had a distinctive healed fracture. Michelle's remains were among those identified through DNA, and she was known to have been friends with Julie Nieto and Virginia Cloven because they often worked in the same area. In fact, Michelle had once been arrested alongside Cinnamon, highlighting how intertwined these women's lives were, and it really shows that maybe if police had taken this seriously, they would have noticed the very, very clear pattern. And to Michelle's family, of course, she was way much more than her addiction. Dan remembers his daughter as a sweet girl who loved music and poetry. The realization that Michelle's unborn baby was also a victim deeply shook investigators. It underscored the depravity of the killer because he obviously had to have known she was pregnant. And for the public, this detail garnered outrage. At memorials, 2 crosses would be placed for Michelle, one for her and one labeled Baby Valdez. Dan Valdez became an advocate for the families, often speaking at conferences, and he participated in a documentary episode of Dateline about the case. He looked directly into the camera to address the unknown murderer. You took away my only daughter and my grandbaby. We will never stop looking for you. In 2021, Dan and other members were present when the city unveiled a new memorial structure at the park where the victims' names, including Baby Valdez, are now engraved in stone. All of these women, all 12 of these human beings, vanished between 2001 and 2005 and were found all together in 2009. Their background overlapped in tragic ways. 10 of 11 of the women had struggles with drug abuse and were involved in sex work or a similar high-risk lifestyle. The only exception was the teenager Jamie Borrello, who might have just kind of been caught in the crossfire of it all. Many of them knew each other or ran in the same circles, frequenting the transient motels and strolling along Central Avenue. So these connections hint that this killer probably hunted his victims and preyed on a close-knit subculture where women might not immediately be reported missing by authorities and where a pattern could go unnoticed for years. In 2005, Detective Ida Lopez of Albuquerque's missing unit person did actually notice something alarming: a string of missing women with similar profiles. And so she began compiling a list. Now, incredibly, all of the women on Detective Lopez's list ended up being West Mesa victims. And she had been ringing alarm bells about these disappearances years before the mass grave was found. Sadly, her list only found confirmation when the bone pit on the mesa was unearthed. But the families of the West Mesa women have bonded together in grief and resolve. They formed support groups and hold annual vigils every February around the date of the discovery. In 2015, the city dedicated that memorial on top of the very site where the women were found, which I don't know if I would want to see that memorial all the time and go visit the very place my loved one was buried in order to honor their life, but that's just me. Good on the city for finally taking it seriously, I guess. It's just such a shame that there was ample opportunity for these women to get justice. They were reported missing. There were very, very clear connections between all of them. If you had just, put their pictures up on a wall and made the little investigatory web, I'm sure you would have figured out some kind of connection. It just goes to show how tragic it is that when women who are kind of living on the fringes of society go missing, it's just not taken seriously, and it's heartbreaking. But when all of the skeleton remains were found, the investigation did take a turn, because from the moment the West Mesa bone field was uncovered, investigators faced pretty much a forensic nightmare. Unlike many homicide cases, this wasn't a fresh crime scene with intact bodies, or traces of evidence, or any obvious murder weapons. Instead, police were dealing with literally bones in the ground that had endured years of weathering. And this presented enormous challenges in determining how the victims were killed, when the murders happened, and collecting any physical evidence linking to a perpetrator. The medical investigators couldn't even pinpoint exact causes of death for any of the women due to the advanced state of their decomposition. There were no bullet holes or sharp force marks on the skeletons, and no ligatures left behind. So that ruled out some causes, like no evidence of stabbing or shooting, but it left open the possibility of strangulation or suffocation, which often leaves no real mark on the bone. In their reports, examiners explicitly noted that strangulation may not leave any detectable injuries to skeletal remains and thus couldn't be ruled out. Investigators strongly suspect many of the West Mesa victims were strangled, a common modus operandi in serial killings of sex workers, but they still lack definitive proof. The lack of clear cause also means each death had to be labeled generically as homicide by unspecified means, which could complicate prosecution if a suspect is ever caught. Prosecutors prefer knowing exactly how each victim was killed to try to tie the suspect to the act. But here they would have to rely on mostly circumstantial evidence or patterns. Additionally, pinning down when the murders happened was another challenge. However, investigators had a stroke of luck in the form of satellite imagery. Overhead images taken of the West Mesa between 2003 and 2005 showed disturbed soil and tire tracks in the area where the bodies were found. By examining these photos, detectives deduced that the last burial likely occurred in late 2005, after which development activity, the grading and the dumping of fill dirt, had started to alter the landscape. And indeed, by 2006, the site was disrupted by construction. So this probably made the killer try to avoid the area. But he was probably thinking, oh, great, there's going to be a house built over this burial site. I'm scot-free. So police concluded that the murders and the burials happened between 2001 and 2005. And this aligns with the victims' known disappearance dates. But still, trying to narrow down the time of death for each victim individually is really difficult to do without more evidence. Investigators have to rely on missing persons reports to try to approximate when each woman was killed. For example, Jamie Barella and Evelyn Salazar disappeared in spring of 2004 and were most likely killed then. But Michelle Valdez was last seen in September 2004, so you can probably guess was likely killed later in that year. But it's still like assembling a puzzle that has all these pieces missing. We know the order, we know the span, but we don't know the exact timetable or the frequency with which the killer struck. And perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the West Mesa case is the complete lack of physical evidence left at the burial site. Crime scene investigators recovered few things beyond bones. According to APD, none of the women's clothing was found, and no personal identification, jewelry, or cell phones were recovered. The scene was totally stripped of any obvious clues. So, this means that likely the killer took these very intricate steps to minimize evidence, perhaps dumping the bodies naked and in garbage bags. And indeed, police did find that several victims had been buried in plastic trash bags, remnants of which were actually recovered at the crime scene. Now, while these bags hint at the method of disposal, they still didn't yield traceable information like a fingerprint or a distinct, unique brand to a suspect. But there was one intriguing clue found in the burial area. This was a tree tag, the kind of plastic tag that comes on nursery bought plants. And detectives actually managed to track that tag to a specific nursery that one suspect used to visit. However, it's unclear if the tag was directly linked to the graves or just kind of coincidentally in the soil. Nonetheless, it did become a small piece of circumstantial evidence against a potential suspect. Another forensic avenue was soil analysis. If the killer's vehicle or tools had picked up distinct West Mesa soil, that could be matched. But by the time the bodies were found years and years later, any soil on suspects or their belongings was long gone, obviously. Forensic entomology and botany can sometimes help place a time frame on burials, but the site's disturbance and New Mexico's variable climate likely limited their usefulness. But investigators did note that a layer of fill dirt was on top of some of the remains, indicating that the graves may have been covered over by construction grading in 2006. In 2018, some bones were found nearby, raising alarm that there might be more victims. But luckily, those turned out to be ancient ancestral remains, totally unrelated to the case. But this just kind of further complicated the forensic landscape and did end up leading to a false lead. Did end up leading to a false lead. Sorry, that was like a rough sentence to say. And of course, this crime scene might not actually be a crime scene. It's basically a burial site. So that was the biggest challenge when it comes to this investigation because authorities never located the actual primary crime scene, like the place where the women were actually killed. Investigators surmise that the killer lured or grabbed the women elsewhere, possibly in his vehicle or at a house, murdered them, and then transported their bodies to the mesa late at night for burial. So, this means that the actual murder scenes where you might find blood or more DNA evidence was totally unknown. And over the years, APD has quietly searched various locations for signs of graves or evidence of killings. In 2018, acting completely on a tip, they conducted an extensive search with ground penetrating radar in an area east of the city to try to find any trace of the missing women. But nothing was conclusive. In 2021, another trip prompted a dig at a site on the West Mesa, but it yet again yielded no new evidence. So, recognizing these challenges, law enforcement ended up forming a multi agency 118th Street task force very early in the case. FBI analysts joined APD detectives to try to brainstorm the angles they could use. The FBI conducted crime analysis in 2009 and again in 2013, offering investigative suggestions and profiling insights. They remain involved with the Albuquerque FBI Division special agent in charge, emphasizing that the Bureau plans to stick with this until the mystery is solved. They're leveraging any new technology to try to recheck evidence. Now, as of 2022, the FBI also offered a separate reward of $50,000, included within the total $100,000 reward for any information leading to the killer's identification. Now, despite the lack of evidence, there have been a couple suspects potentially linked to this crime. Now, with that task force, dozens of local officers were assigned exclusively to track leads. And the immediate question was, who were those victims and who killed them? Now, early on, tips started flooding in because the case was making national headlines. Crime Stoppers even offered $100,000 for information. Detectives interviewed relatives, friends, and known associates of each victim to try to establish timelines and commonalities. And finally, they started to see those patterns that had emerged. Many women frequented the East Central Corridor. Many were last seen at night, and some mentioned going to parties on the West Side before disappearing. So they started analyzing phone records from that era. But it did prove to be difficult due to retention limits. But where available, they did look for numbers that were common to multiple victims. And within months, certain names of interest started popping up. As one APD investigator noted, one name kept floating to the top of most reports, and that name was Lorenzo Montoya. Now, Lorenzo's story reads like a glaring neon sign pointing directly to a serial killer, which is why many in law enforcement and the public believe that he was the West Mesa perpetrator. Montoya lived less than 3 miles from the burial site, in a trailer in a semi-rural mobile home park in the shadow of the West Mesa. A press operator at a local printing company, he had an unassuming life by day, but a very dark side by night. Montoya had a history of soliciting sex workers and a pattern of violence against them. In 1999 and 2003, he was arrested for attacking prostitutes, tying one up and choking another. But each time, charges were dropped or pled down, so he never actually saw significant jail time. He reportedly even told his girlfriend once during an argument that he would kill her and bury her in lime on the mesa. And chillingly, coworkers later recalled Montoya bragging or joking about how he knew how to dispose of a body in the desert. And Montoya's claims escalated. In December 2006, he arranged to hire a teenage sex worker named Sharika Hill. He took her to his trailer and proceeded to R-word and strangle her with cord and duct tape. Montoya had essentially acted out what one could only imagine happened to the West Mesa victims. However, and luckily, fate intervened. As Montoya was loading Sharika's lifeless body into his car, the young woman's boyfriend, who had secretly followed her, confronted Montoya, and a fight ensued. The boyfriend shot Montoya dead on the spot. Police arrived to find a gruesome but very straightforward scenario. A killed in the act situation. The killing of Sharika Hill was horrifying on its own, but what drew detectives' attention was the eerie possibility that Montoya had done this before. At the time, law enforcement said they did not believe that this was the first time Montoya had killed someone because the crime was too brutal. That's what literally one report noted. And indeed, after Montoya's death, no more known murders of this type occurred in Albuquerque. And even more circumstantial evidence started to pile up. Aerial photos showed dirt tracks leading from Montoya's trailer park toward the burial site during the time frame of the murders. He lived so close that he could have easily driven a body out in minutes under the cover of darkness. Montoya also matched the psychological profile as a local who knew the area well and felt comfortable there, and he clearly was since he lived nearby and likely scouted burial spots in advance. Cold case investigator Liz Thompson later commented that whoever buried the women was very comfortable with the place, had concealment, someone who prays, who's out there, an actual predator, unquote. And Montoya fit that description. When police searched Montoya's trailer after his death, they uncovered something very disturbing. A home video that Montoya had filmed showing him engaged in sex with an unconscious or possibly even deceased woman. The video then cuts to audio of duct tape ripping and a garbage bag rustling. APD released screenshots of the unidentified woman on the tape to the public, fearing she could be another victim of Montoya and asking for help identifying her. The video strongly suggests that Montoya might have killed at least one other woman prior to Sharika Hill. Who was she? She might have been one of the Mesa 11. Despite the mountain of suspicion, Montoya was never formally named an official suspect in this case because he died before the victims were even discovered. Police couldn't interrogate him or charge him, but APD has made it very clear that he's their best suspect. And the Montoya theory, while it's very compelling, isn't necessarily airtight. Skeptics point out that Montoya typically met women by hiring them to come to his home. But none of the West Mesa victims are known to have visited Montoya's trailer, though in that world, appointments aren't necessarily traceable. And also, Montoya's 2006 victim was African American, just like Salania Edwards, and a teen, suggesting that he didn't strictly target one race or age. Montoya was 39 when he died. If he was the killer, he would have been in his early 30s during the murders, which is quite plausible. But the biggest counter-argument is simply the lack of the proof. Without that, the case can't be closed. Montoya is essentially the prime suspect by default. One victim's mother summed it up, "I know in my heart they are long gone. That's what gives me peace," she said of the perpetrators, echoing the widespread belief that Montoya did it and his death was some kind of cosmic justice. But still, police officially keep the doors open to other possibilities, stating that they are not 100% certain and thus continuing to investigate other leads. Now, another name started to draw in attention: This name was Fred Reynolds, a local pimp and known associate of some of the missing women. Reynolds died of natural causes in January 2009, just weeks before the West Mesa bone field was discovered. And this timing was either coincidental or, as some wondered, suspiciously convenient. If he were involved, he died right before the evidence surfaced. And Reynolds had a history of involvement in Albuquerque's underground sex trade. He'd once run an escort service called Have Mercy Escorts and had been arrested multiple times for promoting prostitution. But what raised eyebrows was that he reportedly knew several of the victims, including Dorene Marquez and Victoria Chavez, and even possessed photographs of the missing women. When police searched his belongings after his death, they indeed found photos of at least one West Mesa victim. Some sources say it was a nude photo of Victoria Chavez, likely used for escort advertisements. But why did he have these? Possibly because of his work as a pimp, but it also suggested that he definitely knew these women. Reynolds himself had gotten clean from drugs and was said to have been writing a book or documentary about the plight of sex workers. Some acquaintances claimed that he was actually trying to help the women get off the streets in his later years, while others saw him as exploiting them. Could Reynolds have been the killer or an accomplice? Or someone who just had knowledge? But I guess we'll just never know. However, he was significantly older and didn't seem to fit the profile of someone who would be capable of digging graves constantly. However, investigators couldn't just ignore him. They scoured his phone records, contacts, and writings. But ultimately, Reynolds was never labeled as a suspect publicly. The APD only noted that he was a pimp who knew one of the missing women and reportedly had photos of some of the missing sex workers, unquote. But he died before he could be questioned. The consensus is that Reynolds might have had information about the case. Perhaps he knew the girls were being killed, but there's no evidence that he was the murderer. His death is so close to the discovery, and it's probably just a coincidence, albeit one that deprived the investigation of a potential valuable witness who might have been able to show more light on the victim's circles. So by this point, they're totally without leads. The leads have run dry, and years passed without a single arrest. By 2014, the West Mesa Task Force had scaled down, and there was only one detective, that one, Ida Lopez, who remained assigned the case full time. And then a completely separate case unexpectedly revived interest in yet another man, Joseph Larry Blee. Blee was a local Albuquerque man with a long rap sheet of sexual violence. Back in the 80s, he was known as the mid-school R-worder for breaking into homes near McKinley Middle School and R-wording young girls. And he'd evaded capture for decades. In 2010, a backlog of R-word kits was tested and matched Blee's DNA to one of the old cases. And in 2015, he was convicted and sent to prison for those R-words, which just goes to show, please go get a test kit done. Please go get an R-word kit done if you feel like something happened to you, whether you were conscious during it, not conscious during it. It could lead to something down the line. It could lead to something right now. I know it's so vulnerable. It might be painful, but there's no reason to feel any shame. You should be doing that to protect yourself and others. Oh, it's just, I feel like I've heard so many stories of women experiencing that and being too afraid to go get an R-word kit. And I just want to take a second to encourage you to do it if it happens, and just report it, because you never know how you sharing your voice could bring justice to something like this. But this guy just never wanted to stop despite being arrested. By the 90s and 2000s, he'd moved on from teenagers and decided to start targeting sex workers. Albuquerque vice cops in the early 2000s had even caught him cruising the quote war zone track picking up prostitutes. When police took a closer look, they realized that he was a familiar figure around the Eastern Central prostitution community, the same community all of our victims came from. One woman reported that he liked to take women to the Mesa area for sex, which obviously raised alarm bells. More damningly, His DNA was found on the inner waistband of a prostitute who was found murdered on Central Avenue in 2004. And this victim was not actually buried on the mesa. She was discovered shortly after her own death, but it proved that he had potentially killed at least one sex worker in Albuquerque. So now with him in prison for other crimes, APD started to seriously consider him as the possible West Mesa serial killer. And a search of his home would turn up some eerie items. He had a stash of women's jewelry and underwear that did not belong to, get this, his wife or daughter. He has a wife and a daughter, y'all. So to detectives, this looked like trophies from victims. And it kind of showed that this was a classic serial killer's behavior of collecting mementos of his victims. Additionally, remember that tree tag that we said was found at the burial site? Well, it was traced to a nursery that he was known to have shopped at often. Now, while a tree tag is a tiny little piece of circumstantial evidence, in an evidence scarce case, it really stood out. Investigators also reportedly learned that he had once mentioned to a cellmate that he hired prostitutes who he referred to as trashy, perhaps hinting at the low regard he had for them. By around 2015, he became the sole focus of intense scrutiny. Police, they were careful though. They didn't publicly call him a suspect, only a person of interest. They re-interviewed many of his acquaintances and potential surviving victims to see if he ever exhibited violence. There is some evidence that APD convened a grand jury to examine evidence against him for the West Mesa murders, but ultimately no indictment came. Why? Likely because the case was still largely circumstantial, and he strongly denied his own involvement. Now, it's possible that his DNA was compared to any DNA fragments from the burial site, if any existed, because we haven't really heard any public exclamations of DNA being found at the site. They're trying to keep that kind of hush hush, but it seems like no match has been found, or there simply wasn't really any usable DNA at the crime scene. And he was already serving a 90-year sentence for the R-word convictions, effectively ensuring that he would never walk free. So this might have reduced the urgency to immediately charge him in the West Mesa case without slam dunk evidence. Investigators didn't just close the book on him, however. As of the latest updates, he remains a top person of interest. APD cold case detective Liz Thompson in 2022 acknowledged that they spent significant time investigating persons of interest. Joseph Blee and Lorenzo Montoya, who both had a history of violence against women, were two of them. So while Montoya has the stronger geographical link, Blee has the stronger behavioral link. Some within law enforcement even theorized that both men might have been involved or one was a copycat of the other, but there is no proof of that. But honestly, I could totally see that. We have this Joseph dude on the streets targeting victims, bringing them to Montoya's house where they do whatever creepy stuff they do, and then casually and conveniently dropping their bodies in the mesa. And if Montoya lives that close to the mesa, he's able to see and detect if anyone is going to that dump site. So usually, I think we all know with a construction site, there is a lot of prep that goes into it. It's not just like trucks show up one day and start excavating. You can usually see, people coming in and out. You can see people maybe testing the soil. You can see people, getting permits and making sure it's safe to dig in certain areas and what have you. But he could have totally been the eyes of the operation. And perhaps with him dead, it meant that Joseph couldn't continue to make these killings so convenient for themselves because Montoya maybe told him that they didn't have a drop site. Now, one telling line came from Chief Medina in late 2022 when he said that APD has 3 suspects in this case. He didn't name them, but it's not hard to infer that they're Montoya, Blee, and perhaps a third, which could be an unidentified trafficker or someone like Fred Reynolds, or maybe even a third mysterious person from out of state. So, this comment suggests that police aren't putting all their eggs in one basket. They recognize that without definitive evidence, they have to keep an open mind. Now, while all of these suspects did receive a lot of attention, the task force also explored whether the West Mesa killings were part of multiple people or part of a broader organized crime ring. Now, this theory gained some traction, especially after no single suspect was able to be nailed down in the first few years. Perhaps, some investigators pointed out, these murders weren't the handiwork of a lone serial killer, but rather a sex trafficking or drug cartel operation that routinely eliminated women. One intriguing clue was an anonymous tip that came in linking the murders to a suspect from El Salvador, possibly connected to a Central American trafficking ring. The tip suggested that this ring would abduct or traffic sex workers and might have disposed some of them on the West Mesa. The FBI followed this lead, given El Salvador's notorious MS-13 gang presence and their expansion into U.S. cities. However, nothing concrete emerged publicly from that line of inquiry. Another angle was the observation that many of the women disappeared around the time of the annual New Mexico State Fair that's held each September. An FBI analyst noted that trafficking rings sometimes operate around big events that draw large crowds and thus demands for prostitution. The theory goes that maybe a ring from outside would come in during events, recruit or kidnap local sex workers, and then dump their bodies. Albuquerque's fair was mentioned as one such event, and there were also whispers about connections to similar cases in Denver, Las Vegas, or even Phoenix, since these traffickers seemed to move along the Southwest Circuit. However, there's been no evidence that has linked the West Mesa murders to any out of state cases. It all remains speculation. There was also this serial killer angle that prompted the task force to try to compare notes with other jurisdictions. They looked at a number of unsolved murders of sex workers along the I-40 corridor and beyond. One name that came up was Scott Lee Kimball, a convicted serial killer in Colorado who in 2010 bizarrely claimed that he was being investigated for West Mesa. Kimball denied killing the women and had no real ties to Albuquerque. His claims seemed more to be like attention seeking from a notorious criminal, and nothing really linked him to the case. Now, everything is pointing to this being a total cold case, which is absolutely heartbreaking. So many victims, all dumped in the same site, totally discarded like they're nothing, who knew each other, who all had links to a similar community, the same community. But luckily, by 2019, the APD was publicly stressing that the case was active, not cold. As for the latest updates, Albuquerque police say they are still actively following leads and even indicate that they have persons of interest under surveillance. This suggests that they haven't zeroed in exclusively on anyone, perhaps because of lingering doubts or lack of incontrovertible evidence. And the Albuquerque Police Department does express that they are persistent in their search. So if you know any details, if you've seen anything, if you think it could be connected to another murder in the area, or if you live in the area and you know some of these people, or you're aware of a case going on that's similar to this, please let us know. I'll leave resources down in the description box. Now, we've highlighted the victims here, but you just really can't talk about a case like this that's gone unsolved for so many years without acknowledging the overarching issue that it's highlighting, and that's the vulnerability of marginalized women. All of these victims lived risky lives where their disappearances initially raised zero alarm or very little alarm. And Albuquerque law enforcement has faced a lot of criticism for the perceived slow response. And in a way, the West Mesa case did become a catalyst for change. APD now works more closely with organizations that advocate for sex workers and missing persons. Detective Lopez's once ignored list is now essentially departmental gospel. They keep track of every missing person with similar profiles immediately. The case also draws parallels to the broader issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and others. Though none of the West Mesa victims were Native American, the phenomenon of police overlooking missing women from disenfranchised groups is similar and is in an area where there are a lot of Native American people. New Mexico has since set up a task force to address MMIW cases, and one can argue that the West Mesa case did help spur that consciousness. And the West Mesa murders totally changed Albuquerque. The sheer scale of the crime, 11 women, shook the community's sense of security and forced a reckoning with how we treat the missing. The victims' families, once feeling alone and dismissed, formed a network of support and became advocates that the city no longer ignore. As family member Judy Nieto, mother of Julie, said, "We're one day closer to finding answers." And this is a phrase that became a sort of rallying cry. It's a reminder that hope still sustains them. Now, I know that this is such a chilling case. It's chilling, it's heartbreaking, it's scary, and it kind of makes you wonder who or what is lurking in your community just waiting for an opportunity. We really need to be safe now more than ever. There's so many means that people will go to do terrible things like this. So I'm just really trying to implore you all to please, please be careful. And let me know what you think about this case. And of course, share any other additional information or insight that you might have. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. I'll see you in my next video very soon.